Hello, everybody. Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to the sixth and final part of our series on John Locke, itself part of a larger lecture series on the foundations of Western political thought. Today we're going to take a look at Locke's labor theory of property. Now, it's been a while since we last met. If you have not seen the earlier videos in this series, you're going to want to do so. We have mostly examined Locke's famous and highly influential Second Treatise of Government, first published in 1689. In the last video, we examined Locke's theory of resistance and revolution against tyrannical government. And at the time of his book's publication, this was by far the most controversial part of his treatise. However, in our modern day, the most controversial argument that Locke puts forward is not so much his argument in favor of resisting tyranny, but his theory of property, the labor theory of property. And so it deserves a very close look in this sixth and final part of our investigation of John Locke. Now, Locke considers property to be a natural right. It's part of the law of nature, and this law of nature, by way of review, obliges everyone. This law of nature is discoverable. The way Jefferson phrased it, self-evident. Everyone, all mankind is subject to this law of nature, and one of the fundamental laws of nature is that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Now, one of the reasons why man enters into the social contract, into society from a state of nature to and subjects himself to rule by government is because in the state of nature, the enjoyment of these natural rights is constantly endangered. This makes man willing to join in society with others for what? For the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates. And by estates, Locke clarifies that he means property. Property. The great and chief end, therefore, according to Locke, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. That's the great and chief end, according to Locke, the preservation of their property. And so this notion of property is absolutely central to Lockean thought, Lockean theory. And it's no accident that during the American Revolution, you read the writings of the American revolutionaries, and they constantly talk about property, the right to property. Now, why? Why this focus on property? Well, they argued, and I am in agreement, that individual rights are inextricably linked with property rights. The two go hand in hand. Well, how do we arrive at that conclusion? Well, if you own your own body, is basic self-ownership. That's what it boils down to, self-ownership. If you own your own body, this necessarily implies that you own your own labor. And if you own your own labor, this in turn necessarily implies a right to the fruit of your own labor. And if you have a right to the fruit of your own labor, this necessarily implies exclusive property rights. So again, it all boils down to self-ownership. Now, the opposite of self-ownership is slavery. A slave cannot own property because he does not even own his own body, and by extension does not own his own labor. Someone else owns his labor, and by extension cannot own the fruits of his own labor. Again, because it's not his, it's not under his possession. Someone else has a claim on the fruits of the labor, on the labor itself, and on the very body of the slave. He is owned by somebody else. Locke articulates this expressly in the second treatise of government. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. There you have it. Self-ownership. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. For this reason, the libertarian anarchist thinker Murray Rothbard argued, quote, there are no human rights that are separable from property rights. Now, a lot of people would hear that and say, what? How could that be? Well, again, if you boil it down to ownership of yourself as an individual, then everything, Rothbard argued, emanates from that principle. Things like the right to free speech, for example, emanates from that principle of self-ownership. If somebody else or any other entity at all has an absolute claim over the fruits of your labor, then you are not truly free in any individual sense. At best, you become an interchangeable cog or widget within the corporate collective. At worst, you live a life of total misery. In a free society, the state does not have an absolute claim over your property. And if they do, then you are no longer living in a free state. You are no longer living in a free society. So there's that moral argument in favor of property. There's also a utilitarian argument. Douglas North, the famous Nobel Prize winning economic historian, argued this. He said, quote, the security of property rights has been a critical determinant of the rate of saving and capital formation. And he went on to describe the benefits of property rights. It reduces transaction costs. It facilitates exchange. It provides incentives to entrepreneurship. It's economically efficient. It incentivizes production. It encourages and allows for economic growth. Now, unlike Rothbard, North argued that the state is responsible for the efficiency of the property rights structure. So there's that utilitarian element on top of the moral argument. Locke is in agreement with both. By the way, we see this in Abraham Lincoln. This is a speech that Lincoln gave. Property is the fruit of labor. Labor theory of property. Property is desirable, is a positive good in the world, Lincoln said. That some should be rich shows that others may become rich, and hence is just encouragement to industry and enterprise. Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him labor diligently and build one for himself, thus by example assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built. Great quotation there from President Lincoln. So let's take a look at what Locke has to say about property in the second treatise and how he defends it, and let's flesh out this labor theory of property. Consider the state of nature. And we had a whole video on the state of nature. I think it was part 3 or something. Maybe it was part 4. Part 3 of this series. In the state of nature, all things, the fruits that the state of nature produces, the berries, the beasts of the field, the deer in the forest, all belong to mankind in common. Why? Because, well, they're produced by the spontaneous hand of nature. And nobody, Locke says, has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind. So in the state of nature, everything belongs to man in common. And yet, Locke continues, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or other before they can be of any use or at all beneficial to any particular man. If they just remain wild in a state of nature, it's of no use to man. Locke argues very forcibly, and I believe convincingly, that the condition of human life, which requires labor and materials to work on, necessarily introduces private possessions. Private possessions emerge inevitably. It's a requirement in the condition of human life. Though the earth, he says, and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. We looked at this quote earlier. This is self-ownership. You own your own labor. So then, whatsoever he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So you take something wild, something that is in the state of nature that is unowned, unpossessed. Once you mix your labor in with that thing, you join it to something that is your own body, your own labor, and it thereby becomes your property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. Now it becomes the exclusive property of that person. And in fact, if someone afterward were to come in and take that item, to claim that item, it would clearly be theft. It would be a breaking of the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. Because this, whatever the product of that labor is, now belongs exclusively to that person. For this labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Here we have a qualifier, one of two major qualifiers that Locke injects into his treatise. At least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Sometimes this is known as the Lockean proviso, especially the qualifier that he puts in respect to land ownership. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. But the point is, look, you own your own labor. This is unquestionable. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Well, at what point did those apples or acorns become his? Well, they became his when he picked them up. The act of picking them up instantly made the apple or the acorn his exclusive property. Now, the exception here would be if the apple tree itself is the exclusive property of somebody else. Let's say you planted an apple tree on land that belonged to you. More on land ownership in a moment. And some stranger comes in and picks an apple from your tree, or picks one up off the ground. That's not his property, because the tree was your property, and so by extension all of the apples were your property. So what Locke is talking here is a wild apple tree or a wild oak tree, and in that case it becomes the exclusive property of the man who picks them up. That labor, the act of picking up the apple or the acorn, put a distinction between them and common. It added something to them more than nature. And so they became his private right. And will anyone say he had no right to those acorns or apples he thus appropriated because he had not the consent of all mankind to make them his? Of course not. It is the taking any part of what is common. Again, remember, in a state of nature, all is common. All is common. is that taking any part of what is common and removing it out of the state nature leaves it in, which begins the property. The deer, for example, was the common right of everyone, but it became the exclusive property of the one who hath killed it. The moment the hunter kills the deer, his labor has been annexed to the deer, to the meat, and it is now his. The ocean and all its creatures are common of mankind, but he who catches a fish makes it his. The act of catching the fish makes it the exclusive property of the fisherman. So, what about the earth itself? What about the land? Can that too be owned privately? Can that too be owned exclusively? And here we have probably the most contentious part of Locke's argument. Most reasonable people will accept the chain of reasoning we just delineated. However, land, can you own land? Can you own the earth itself? Locke says yes. And I think he makes a very compelling argument, one that I also agree with. Well, what is that argument? Locke says, I think it is plain that property, and that too in land, is acquired as the former. As much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. He by his labor does, as it were, enclose it from the common. And so the act of working with the soil, working with the land, tilling it, planting upon it, improving it. What are some examples of improvements? Well, clearing away trees would be an improvement to the land. Building a home upon the land would be an improvement to the land. Building a fence to keep in livestock, for example, would be an improvement upon the land. And there are many other structures. Maybe a dam is built, a mill, whatever. That this improvement upon the land, this mixing in of labor with the land, of annexing one's own labor to that land, now makes it the exclusive property of the man who improves it. Nor was this appropriation of any parcel of land by improving it any prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough and as good left. Here we have, again, the Lockean proviso. So nobody's harmed by this. There's still land available. There's still enough land out there for others. Who does it harm that this person has improved the land and now claims it as his exclusive property? Locke says no one, so long as there is still enough and as good left. So that, in effect, there was nevertheless left for others because of his enclosure for himself. For he that leaves as much as another can make use of does as good as take nothing at all. Nobody could think himself injured by the drinking of another man, though he took a good draught, who had a whole river of the same water left him to quench his thirst. In the case of land and water, where there's enough of both, is perfectly the same. Now, critics of Locke have pointed out, well, there are many situations where there is no more land available, and there's not enough left. And so does Locke's theory of landed property still apply in those situations? And this is an admittedly very fuzzy and complex element to Locke's overall case. How do you define enough, and who determines what that is? It seems a bit arbitrary. Locke introduces this qualifier, however, and make what you will of it. Maybe in the comments below you can leave some of your ideas. But that's the Lockean proviso, that nobody's hurt by the exclusive property of this land by the landowner, because there's still enough left. God gave the world to men in common. At the creation of the world, all was common. That state of nature, all land was common. But since he gave it to them for their benefit, it cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. He, that is God, gave it to the use of the industrious and rational, and labor was to be his title to it. So, according to Locke, labor was the means by which God determined that property would come about. And again, you see this in that creation mandate in Genesis. Surely God did not create the world and intend for it to, again, remain common and uncultivated. Locke reasons. Well, what about some of these common lands? What about the English commons? At the time that Locke was writing, a little more than half of the agricultural land in England was not yet enclosed. It was still common lands. In fact, the enclosure of lands, private land ownership in the modern sense, did not really begin until about the 15th century in England and accelerated in the 16th century. But again, at the time of Locke's writing, there were still most lands in England were still held in common. And so what of these? Well, Locke argues that actually the English common lands don't violate his principles of property ownership at all. The main difference is that it's property that is held collectively rather than individually. For though it be common in respect to some men, Locke says, it's not common to all mankind, but it's the joint property of this village or this parish or that community, whatever. It's left common by compact, but only to the commoners in that area. And so the common lands really are the exclusive property of the village, of the community. The rights to use the land, though not possessed individually, are still exclusive. So this still fits within the Lockean framework. It's just in a collective sense rather than an individual sense. Now, there are problems with this form of this land system. It's a lot less efficient than other systems of private individual property ownership. And it does require that individuals sacrifice or subordinate their own rights to the local village or community. If you look at the history of the economic history of England, the enclosure movement, the enclosure of the common lands, led unquestionably to increased efficiency, better farming practices. Crop yields were a lot higher after enclosure than they were before. Productivity increased, standard of living across the board increased, because private individual land ownership incentivized these land improvements. Whereas if you lived on the commons, even though it was the exclusive property of that village and community, as an individual you didn't have as much incentive to improve upon the land. And so from Locke's perspective, individual private land ownership is superior to this system. However, this system can still and may still fit within a Lockean framework. I mean, if individuals want to join together and establish a community with a common lands and they agree to this system by compact, okay, they're free to do that. That's within their right and liberty. But you shouldn't expect that system to be anywhere close to as efficient as an individual private land ownership system. Land that is improved upon is far more beneficial, is a net benefit for humanity than land that is left in common to nature. Locke explains, he who appropriates land to himself by his labor does not lessen, but increase the stock of mankind. For the provisions serving to the support of human life produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land are 10 times more than those which are yielded by an acre of land of an equal richness lying waste in common. So this act of cultivating the land is, again, a net win for humanity. Therefore, he that encloses land and has a greater plenty of the conveniences of life from 10 acres than he could have from 100 left to nature may truly be said to give 90 acres to mankind. For his labor now supplies him with provisions out of 10 acres which were but the product of 100 lying in common. I've here rated the improved land very low, Locke says. He's underestimated how beneficial cultivated land is for humanity. I've rated the improved land here very low, he says, and making its product but as 10 to 1. It's probably much nearer to 100 to 1. So he's just sort of putting out figures. He's playing with numbers. But he is right. Cultivated land is much more economically productive than uncultivated land. There's zero question about that. None. It's indisputable. For I ask, Locke continues, whether in the wild woods and uncultivated waste of America, left to nature without any improvement, tillage, or husbandry, 1,000 acres yield the needy and wretched inhabitants as many conveniences of life as 10 acres of equally fertile land do in Devonshire, where they are well cultivated. 1,000 acres of uncultivated wilderness in America will be as productive as 10 acres of fertile land would be, is Locke's argument here. Let anyone consider what the difference is between an acre of land planted with tobacco or sugar, sown with wheat or barley, and an acre of the same land lying in common, without any husbandry upon it, and he will find that the improvement of labor makes the far greater part of the value. Correct. He's correct about that. Now, here we get into the most controversial part of Locke's argument. What are the implications for Native Americans at this time in North America? Locke says this: there cannot be a clearer demonstration of anything than several nations of the Americans are of this, who are rich in land and poor in all the comforts of life, whom nature, having furnished as liberally as any other people with the materials of plenty, a fruitful soil, apt to produce in abundance what might serve for food, raiment, and delight, yet for want of improving it by labor, have not 1/100th part of the conveniences we enjoy. He said, look at that continent. All the resources. We wonder at that today, don't we? We look at the United States, we're like, wow, an abundance of resources. Locke says, but look at how it's being used currently in the 17th century. It's not being fully utilized. And as a result, the material standard of living for the Native Americans is much lower than it was for almost all peoples in the Old World, minus sub-Saharan Africa. But you look at the Middle East, Europe, India, Asia, all had, materially speaking, a higher standard of living than the peoples of North America at this time. And Locke attributes that to a lack of improvement by labor of the land. And again, here we encounter that the controversial element of Locke's treatise and his theory of property. Now, if you look at Native American cultures at this time, it's not that they were completely without agriculture. They did have some agriculture. corn, beans, and squash were nicknamed the Three Sisters. And the growth of those goods had, Native Americans had been cultivating those goods for centuries before the Europeans arrived. However, this was a semi-sedentary culture. It was, yes, you had some farming, but hunter-gathering was a central part of those societies. And so when the Europeans arrived to this rich continent in the 17th century, they looked around, and North America was sparsely populated. There was a lot of wilderness. There's millions and millions and millions of acres that weren't being utilized outside of a hunter-gatherer framework. And so a conflict inevitably erupted. You had basically a clash of civilizations with two very, very different systems and conceptions of property. It's a very, very complex subject because it was so fresh in the 17th century. Locke mentions it at length, deals with it at length in his treatise. The key question is this: does the usage of land by hunter-gatherers grant rights of ownership to that piece of land for the group that is hunting upon it? Locke would say no, and I think Locke is correct there. The answer is no. You don't simply have rights to the land because you are hunting upon it. Now, as we established earlier, if you're a hunter and you kill a deer, you have property in that deer. You've annexed your labor to that deer. But as a hunter, just the mere act of hunting upon land, whether individually or as a group, as a tribe, that does not establish in any natural law sense property ownership in that land. Now, in practice, for sure, various tribes established primacy over particular territories upon which they hunting grounds, and that territorial primacy was enforced militarily. If a rival group came in and wanted to hunt or utilize that land, they were met with force. They were attacked, and many wars erupted. You look at even the pre-Columbian era, and there was constant warfare between rival Native American groups. And long after Columbus arrived, there was constant warfare between rival Native American groups over hunting grounds. And so certainly you had territorial primacy, but you did not have property in the Lockean sense. And this has implications, of course, for the question of, did European settlers steal land from the Native Americans? And even in that question, you have an assumption about property. If something is stolen, well, the assumption is that it was possessed, that it was property. But if it wasn't property in the natural law sense, which I believe is the correct sense, if it wasn't property in the natural law sense, then it couldn't have been stolen. Now you look at the villages that Native Americans established and farmed upon, that was commonly owned property, the commonly owned property of that tribe or village. Yes, but the hunting grounds are a different matter. And so, again, complex subject. You can see why it's a controversial one. And by the way, please feel free to disagree in the comments below. Leave, what do you think of everything I just said? If you take exception to it, hey, please, by all means, offer a rebuttal in the comments below. Now, I think Locke does take this argument too far in the following sentence. He says, quote, "Land that is wholly left to nature, that hath no improvement of pasturage, tillage, or planting, is called, as indeed it is, waste, and we shall find the benefit of it amount to little more than nothing." Two reasons why I have problems with this argument. Even for a hunter-gatherer society that underutilizes the land compared to how it could be utilized. Even then, it's not next to nothing. It's still something. It's being utilized, and there can be many fruits taken from that land, and so it's not waste. I think in the extremity that Locke is describing it here, it still has benefits, even when it is not cultivated or tilled. However, my other exception here would be the fact that, take a look at the images here. The Grand Canyon on the bottom right. This land is not being improved upon, is it? Is it waste? Does it have no benefit? Well, of course not. It has much benefit, great benefit. It offers us much pleasure by our ability to go visit these national parks and to admire some of these wonders of nature and creation. Of course, we call this conservation. Locke doesn't really leave much room for conservation in this grand theory. Conservation is not irreconcilable, of course, with Locke. You could simply say, well, as a nation, we've decided that certain areas are so beautiful that it is better to keep them in that state of nature, to leave them wholly to nature, and so we're going to conserve them and declare them national goods, national property, call them national parks. And so sometimes it's best if the land is left wholly to nature. Concluding our lecture today, there are, as we've seen, some complications and difficulties with Locke's theory. Difficulty number one, this idea of mixing one's labor with the land. Does this include simply fencing it in and staking it out? You got a large piece of land and I build a fence around it. Voila, it's my land. Well, there is some difficulty there. It's not an easy question to resolve. I don't think it's completely unresolvable, but it's certainly a bit of a tricky thing to work through. As we know, in agriculture, sometimes land has to lay fallow. You're not constantly working it, even initially. However, I would reply and say, well, the act of clearing the trees and yes, beginning to improve upon it, such as laying fences, does qualify as mixing one's labor with the land in such a way that is sufficient to make it the property of that person. However, it is an admitted difficulty. Difficulty number two, we just saw. What do we make of the encounter between two very different civilizations? A semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer civilization with an agricultural civilization, and when the two clash, what do we make of that? How do we work that out? It's not easy. It's a bit of a difficult question. I try to work through some of that here, but it's a difficult one. Number three, also just dealt with, what about the conservation of natural wonders and beauties? This isn't too much of a conflict, so long as you accept a right of the people through the state to block off certain lands to conserve for generations to come. But anyway, as I see it, those are the main difficulties with Locke's theory. Do you find some others? Put them in the comments below. But the main reason why I find Locke's labor theory of property so compelling is looking at the alternatives. What is the alternative? And the alternatives are definitely not satisfactory. Ownership of the land by mere decree. The king or queen coming in and saying, this is my land. I mean, obviously, that's completely arbitrary. You can't have ownership by decree. We're reminded of when the Spaniards would come to America and the conquistador or whoever would declare the land to be this land, everything that we see is the property of the king and queen of Spain. Well, it doesn't work like that. Wrong. obviously property rights are not established by simple decree. What about ownership of the land by just brute sheer force? Well, throughout you could argue throughout history that's how it's worked. A particular individual or a group who has martial supremacy is able to enforce his claim over certain territory simply because if anybody else tries to dispute it, they're going to get killed. Is that a valid method of ownership? Well, it can't be in a natural law sense, because all this would do is incentivize a state of war. If this is the basis of property rights, if force is the basis of property rights, then you're in for a grim situation. And so, just brute force cannot be the basis for property. What about collective ownership? Well, as we've seen, collective ownership can be reconciled with Locke's labor theory of value. You could have a village or a community decide by compact to hold certain things exclusively in common within that village. The problem with collective ownership, even on a local village level, it still remains much more inefficient than private individual ownership. And if you take it beyond a local village level, if you try to apply collective ownership to a large area or to an entire state, it leads more often than not to authoritarianism. As Hayek said, the worst will find a way to the top. And with that much power located within the state apparatus as the representative of the collective, you're going to get some malicious actors coming in and exercising authority in a very oppressive and tyrannical manner. And so collective ownership is not the answer either. If you want to do it on a local community level by compact, voluntary compact, go for it. There's no problem with that in a natural law system, but to try to force that system onto an entire people is authoritarian. And then what is the other alternative to Locke's theory? No property at all, no possessions. Clearly, this is a utopian dream, pipe dream, entirely unrealistic. Sorry, John Lennon. You can imagine a world of no possessions all you like, but it's doesn't work. And so at the end of the day, I think Locke's theory is the most persuasive, notwithstanding a few difficulties here and there. But ultimately, if you deny that a man owns his own labor, if you deny that he possesses the fruits of his own labor, that is in essence a denial of the right to self-ownership. It's elevating other powers, other masters, other entities above that individual. And so Locke, in my view, offers the most compelling theory of property. Thus, labor, Locke says, in the beginning gave a right to property. Labor gave a right to property wherever anyone was pleased to employ it upon what was common. I see this a lot with my two boys. My two boys, I'm about to have a third boy, by the way. He'll be born any day now, but as of now, July 30th, I have two boys. They love Legos. Okay, they love Legos, and they have a Lego bin, a large Lego bin with just an assortment of all sorts of Lego bricks and all different accessories and all the rest. That Lego bin is it's like the commons. It's the common right of anybody who wants to play Legos. So long as it's in the bin, Anyone can pick up a brick and start using it. But as soon as one of the two brothers picks up a Lego brick or a Lego accessory or whatever, picks it up and then starts building with it, he has annexed his labor to that Lego brick and has built it and is using it to build they call them Lego creations. My two boys call Lego creations. At that point, that Lego creation is now the property of that brother. And if the other brother all of a sudden comes in and, yanks it from his hand and starts, trying to use whatever pieces were being utilized in that creation for himself, that's theft, that's stealing. And at that point, I would come in and instruct the brother that this is a violation of the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. And then, of course, when they're done, the Lego creation, with the building Legos, it all goes back in the Lego bin, it all returns to common. But isn't that funny how even for young children, they understand this basic principle that when you annex your labor to something, there are rights of ownership that come along with that. And of course, as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, Abraham Lincoln, property is the fruit of labor. And it's actually under Lincoln's administration that Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862. Homestead Act opened up millions and millions of acres out west to farmers, frontiersmen. Prior to the Homestead Act, it was all publicly owned by the federal government. Lincoln opened it up to homesteaders. You were entitled to go out to land, and if you improved it for at least 5 years, it became yours. And you could do that for up to 150 acres or something like that. It improved for 5 years, it became your land. That's the homesteading principle. The labor theory of property applied. And then money. Money plays a role in Locke's theory of property. Locke was very, very interested in the subject of money and monetary theory. He wrote several books on monetary theory, as a matter of fact. But from Locke's perspective, money, the unique benefit of money is that it allowed hardworking men and women to accumulate property in something that was not perishable. Gold and silver are not perishable. And so if you can accumulate property in this good of long duration, not short duration, but long duration, if you can do that, then that will incentivize further productivity. Locke says this, and thus came in the use of money, some lasting thing that men might keep without spoiling, and that by mutual consent men would take in exchange for the truly useful but perishable supports of life. The benefit of money is that it's imperishable. Gold and silver. Locke argued, and I'm in agreement with him, that gold and silver were uniquely qualified goods to function as a medium of exchange. And if you watch my history of money lectures, you know all about that. Here's some of the money-friendly properties of gold and silver. Locke says, and as different degrees of industry were apt to give men possessions in different proportions, so this invention of money gave them the opportunity to continue and enlarge them. Money was a positive good for civilization, even as the love of money is the root of all evil, as the Bible says. However, money still has this very, very positive function. Find out something that hath the use and value of money amongst his neighbors. You shall see the same man will begin presently to enlarge his possessions. Money and property are Money facilitates the acquisition and accumulation of property. So, that's all. Hope you enjoyed this series on John Locke. And see you next time.